We turn now to the head of the NAACP, Cornell, William Brooks, who is also in Charleston this morning. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. I want to start with the two big questions. Why did this happen, and how do we keep it from happening again? You've talked about the atmosphere that created this. What did you mean by that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to extend my condolences on behalf of the entire NAACP family to the victims of this horrific tragedy and to the family of Emmanuel AME Church. I also want to just lift up that we as Americans will get through this. We cannot underestimate the evil that occurred here, but we cannot, through our faith, underestimate our capacity for good. There is in this country certainly a climate of caring, but there's also an atmosphere of hate. What we've seen in this city across the last few days is a climate of caring. People have come together. They've wrapped their arms around one another. They've extended love to one another. That speaks to the best of who we are. But there's also an atmosphere of hate. This young man who entered a Bible study and received the right hand of fellowship, perhaps received an open Bible from the pastor, laid down that Bible, laid down the hand of fellowship, and took up a gun and assassinated 9 people in what can be called no less than a flesh and blood obscenity. This crime may have occurred in moments, but it came into being over some time. This young man was indoctrinated, radicalized, if you will, with an ideology of white nationalism or racism. And so the point being here is we've got to look at not only this individual act of brutality, we also have to look at the atmosphere from which it emerged. And we have to address that. When we think about the fact that in this country, there's 784 hate groups, the level of hate crimes in this country has remained constant over years. We have to allocate resources to address these hate groups and these hate crimes. The fact of the matter is the Justice Department underestimates the degree of hate crimes in this country because they have to rely on self-reporting. That's a challenge. And the fact that we have at least 200,000 to 300,000 hate crimes in a given year is unconscionable and inconsistent with our values as Americans. So we've got to address that.
Is one of the things I think people are wrestling with here is was this an isolated incident of a crazy, evil person, or was he taking soundings from a larger cultural racism? Where do you stand on that question?
Well, here's what I would note. This young man was wearing a flag of the pre-Nelson Mandela apartheid-era South Africa. He also wore a flag of the nation of Rhodesia, drove a car embellished with the Confederate flag. Each of these symbols is illustrative of an underlying racism in this country among a minority of Americans, but a level of racism and racial bigotry and racist ideology that we cannot blink, we cannot ignore, we have to address. It is a moral ugliness in our midst, but we've got to address that. And so that means very specifically, our houses of faith have to speak to this challenge. We as democratic and moral leaders in this country have to speak to that. But we also need vigorous prosecution and vigorous investigation of these hate groups and the resources to do so. To be clear, we cannot tolerate a de minimis amount of racism and bigotry in our country. It must be stamped out, and particularly this, which is of a violent nature. The fact that you can have a young man enter a Bible study, think about that, a Bible study, target this particular church, this particular city, this particular category of Americans, namely African Americans, and carry out this brutality and evil in our midst. It has to be addressed with resources, with a moral commitment, with a prosecutorial commitment.
Mr. Brooks, defenders of the flag that flies, the Confederate flags that flies, say that what you've just described is a level of evil that's going to exist whether the flag flies or not.
Well, I would beg to differ. The NAACP has led a boycott of the state of South Carolina for years on end because we are endeavoring to bring that flag down. The fact of the matter is that flag represents exclusion, it represents bigotry, it represents bias. There are white nationalist groups across the country who see that flag as representing their values. The fact of the matter is Our American flag represents the values of the majority of Americans. That is inclusion, that is democracy, that is the spirit of our founding fathers and our founding mothers. That Confederate flag does not represent those values, and in 2015, it's an anachronistic emblem of a bygone era at best, and most likely and most representative, a set of values that run contradictory, that run counter to who we are as Americans. It has to come down. It must come down.
I want to ask you a final question about one of the mothers of one of the victims who was there in the church, who spoke at the shooter's bond hearing. She said to him, "We enjoyed you," used that expression. You're a minister, you've led Bible study of exactly this kind. That sense of forgiveness has struck a lot of people. Where does that forgiveness come from, to say, "We enjoyed you," to the man who killed her son?
It speaks to the faith that is taught in the church across the street and the faith that Americans hold dear in their hearts all across this country. The fact is that we have a group of parishioners, students of Scripture, who extended grace and love to a stranger, and their family members, in the wake of their deaths, are still extending grace and love and forgiveness to one who is a stranger. That speaks to the commonality of the faith of those who were slain and those who were left behind, but also to this city and to this country. That is to say, we have within us a tremendous moral capacity to forgive and to love. But it's not enough to forgive and love. We have to also hold accountable. We have to also say to this young man and to those who may have influenced him, we will not allow you to corrupt our democracy. We will not allow you to taint our democracy with this kind of bigotry, bias, and violence.
Cornell.
It is simply unacceptable.
All right, Cornell William Brooks, thanks so much.